Good morning.
Yes, we got it. You ready? We're all here?
I think so. Yes, sir.
Everybody here? Good. Let's get started. Would you like to begin?
Yes, sir. So we are here to talk about the feedback we've received to date related to the potential of a new funding formula, and wanted to walk you through kind of what the process has been, what reflections we've heard, feedback we've heard, and then next steps. And certainly want to talk through any questions that you have. So first, what you'll see is on the engagement process. There's been a robust set of engagement opportunities, and we've been thrilled with the response so far. So the first bucket is on those engagement opportunities that have been led by the Department of Education. And again, just kind of taking a step back from a process perspective, we wanted to ensure that this was something that included all Tennesseans, that whether you were in a school system, you were a parent, you were a business leader, everyone had an opportunity to engage, because education, K-12 education in particular, we know impacts everyone. Those are our future employees, those are our future leaders, those are our future inventors, and certainly our neighbors. And so this is something we thought needed to be a very holistic process across the state. So we have 18 subcommittees, as you know, plus a steering committee. Each of those subcommittees was designed to address one of or multiple big topic areas that we've heard. So we've got a number that are based on urban, suburban, or rural. We have some school system leaders, superintendents. My personal favorite, as everyone knows, is the student subcommittee. We have an educator subcommittee, and then specific groups, students with disabilities, English learners, et cetera. And the idea is to allow all of those subcommittees to really dive into the content of the groups they represent, but then also think about what that means for the whole. It's 6 meetings. They will each have 6 meetings, so 108 total meetings. All of that content goes to the steering committee, made up of leadership in the education and finance committees in the House and the Senate. Everything's recorded and posted on the website, so everything that the department is doing is publicly available, including public comment. Everything is transparently posted. We also had 8 regional town halls. The idea is to have that evenly spread across district types, urban, suburban, and rural. So we wanted to make sure that those were located in a variety of different types of settings, again, to be reflective of all of Tennessee. We had over 500 folks actually physically come, but we had hundreds of folks who have also streamed it or watched it online. And on the top of those 8 town halls, we had 8 local town halls, and those were ones really focused on county commissioners, school board members, and thinking about that local contribution.
So of the regional town halls,
Yes, sir.
Did those include, I think you said this, but, and it says that they're including urban and rural. How did you mix that? Give me an idea where they were.
Yep. So we had 3 in urban, we had 3 in rural, and then we had 2 in suburban or municipals. So the urbans were in Chattanooga, Knoxville, and Memphis. The rurals were in rural communities across the state, and then the 2 suburban-ish were in one in Sumner County and then one in Johnson City. So really tried to do that, and we divided them as 8. We have core regions in the department, so we divide the state into 8 core regions to be reflective. And that was fantastic. We had all sorts of community members come out, parents, business leaders, obviously school district folks. The local funding town halls were more limited. So that was, we had 5 invitations for every district. That was either the county commissioner or commensurate business representative, the superintendent, the school board chair. We had the district finance person, and then a county mayor or similar. So we had 8 of those that just finished up. So the first half was kind of the regional town halls. Then we did the 8 local town halls. We do Twitter town halls. Most folks right now, it's hard to get somewhere after work, or especially if you've got kids and babysitters and all of that. So people have been engaging on Twitter. We send a newsletter out every other week to make sure people understand what's been put on the website and opportunities to engage. And we've got that dedicated email for public comment.
When did the first subcommittee meeting occur?
So that was towards the end of October.
And what about the regional town halls? Were those after?
The regional town halls were also late October through the end of November. So that kind of month. And then these local funding town halls were all last week. So the idea is we held public comment till we finished all of the local or regional town halls. We wanted to make sure that no region had more or less representation to the subcommittee. So they got a big stack of public comment over the last couple of weeks. Now, on top of kind of those are the things that we have led, we've also supported a lot of other public engagement opportunities. So the team built out toolkits, and that's for anyone to kind of plug and play a town hall regionally. We're invited to participate in those. So I've been to a number of town halls and will continue to be at local town halls as invited. We have 1,300 what we're calling school funding ambassadors. So those are people who had indicated they wanted to participate in a subcommittee. We've got about over 200 subcommittee members. Lots of other people wanted to participate. So we created this program where we send out a toolkit of information, and they really represent either their zip code or region and get feedback from their Rotary clubs, their YMCAs, their communities, their neighbors, and then send that back to the department. So they have a more official role in collecting feedback, again, wanting to get that spread across the entire state. But 1,300 Tennesseans signed up, which is pretty incredible for volunteering to do that. We're also very grateful. We worked with Tara and Vanderbilt to be part of the Vanderbilt poll. Now, we didn't help create the questions. We had no role in that, but we did ask for some questions to be put on the poll. They were, I think, really supportive in doing that. We got that data back. And just recently, and I think one of the things that we found is that there was consistency in what they found in the poll from what we're hearing in public comment in the town halls. So that level of consistency has been a real trend. And then we've got a lot of state and national experts who are contributing when there are questions. If a subcommittee member has a question, we're able to call on them and say, can you help us find this information or get some resources so subcommittee members have access to that level of content. More engagement is on additional engagement opportunities. There are a number here. We have our monthly Superintendent Study Council. It is a topic on the agenda every month, and that is an opportunity for those kind of nominated representatives for superintendents can engage or not. It is their choice, but it is on the agenda. We have regional meetings in each of the 8 core areas for the last 3 months or for 3 months. So those are 24 opportunities in small groups. Either myself or a member of my cabinet, her name is Megan McElroy, go either physically or online and talk to superintendents in small groups about their regional needs. And then on top of that, we have a lot of, as you know, very small and rural areas. They might not be able to drive 3 hours to a town hall. And so we've sent out cabinet members to do 54 specific rural district meetings to ensure those districts who can't get to town halls have an in-person opportunity. 36 engagement groups that we meet with regularly. And we also have 4 scheduled meetings with Shelby County Metro Schools and TSEE, which is that small and medium-sized school districts. And they are there so we can listen and hear what their feedback is on the process as well specifically. And so 4 scheduled meetings with those districts.
We've had some of those.
We've had one, we have another one today, and then we'll have 2 more in January,
Gotcha.
Potentially more.
Okay.
But it's really to ensure that we're able to hear directly from them. And then lots of other professional development and district support. Some legislative members said if there's a way we can get some additional content and ask questions. So we are setting up and finishing a procurement to have a third party be able to support some questions they might have, and the same thing for school districts. So we're excited about that. Lots of engagement, hundreds and hundreds of comments have come in. I read them all, no surprise, but it's been interesting to see, I think, such a student focus in the majority of the comments, and I think consistency across what we're hearing. That is a good sign, and I think very unique to Tennessee. People know what they want. They are communicating about that. And in large part, we are seeing a connection to what this will mean for students. And I think throughout the entire conversation, this can't just be about a funding formula in isolation. This is about what funding can do to boost outcomes for our students and ensure they have access to a high quality public education. So excited about that. From a process perspective, you see that here. I think the graph on the next slide on the process structure is a little bit of a better visual there. But all of this content will go to the subcommittees. They will discuss and review and provide recommendations. Those recommendations go to that steering committee, and Commissioner Ely and I are on that with, of course, the leaders and the Ed and Senate, House and, or I'm sorry, the House and Senate Finance and Education Committee members or leads. So they will then look at that, give us additional feedback, and that is what we will then use to produce a structure by the end. So that's a little bit about just kind of the big engagement process. From a timing perspective and the why now and why this is important at this time, I think one of the things we've really been thinking about as a department is that there's been significant and consistent trends in the feedback for the last 15 years. So we know the BEP is over 30 years old and hasn't been meaningfully revised for quite some time. We've also seen BEP review committees since 2004. A similar trend has come out in terms of what those recommendations have been. And then there was a Haslam task force that lasted for just over a year, and that's that more traditional structure. And you have the committee, they hear from experts and members of the public, and they did that for 14 months and had a set of recommendations. Now this is 6 years later, and we see some updates and some new things, especially coming out of the pandemic. But generally speaking, the larger trends have remained generally consistent over that time period. And so when you look at kind of the three different ways to engage on a new funding formula, you've got your review committees, you've got your task force, and now we have this robust public comment period. If you're seeing similar trends, it really is then the now what action part. And so I think that's been really, I think, affirming, certainly for those who participated, and we're excited about that. And then I think, we've seen a lot of change. The pandemic has created opportunities for us to really push and innovate in education. We've seen our districts respond to that. I think we're all in the space of what's the next phase in education. And so we've got that opportunity now with a well-designed strategy for state investment. This isn't just about dollars. This is about making sure that when dollars are invested, there is a formula that leads towards strong outcomes for students and really ensures that people know where those dollars are going, how those dollars are being spent, and what outcomes were produced from those dollars. We just can't do that right now with the current formula. It's not built to do that. It's a resource-based formula. A student-based formula allows us to really report at the level of grain size that will be transparent to the public and certainly to elected officials about what's happening with the dollars that you invest in public education. And so we're excited about that. And certainly with federal relief funds, it allows for some good transition activities as well. So that's the first part on just the process. And happy to answer any questions that you have on process.
Let me just elaborate a little bit on significant consistent feedback. So an old plan, it's 30 years old, needs to be changed. This effort to change began in 2004. And did we review those recommendations from 2004 and then again in 2014? It occurred again, an effort to update and change. How similar were the recommendations?
They're very similar. So the BEP review committee meets every year since 2004 was the earliest report on the website. Their biggest things were salary disparity for teachers, at risk and English learners, students needing more support, moving to a more consistent local funding, and then really looking at things like technology and deferred maintenance, as well as nurses and counselors. You see a very similar trend of bullets every single year in the BEP review committee. When you look at the task force that was in 2014 to 2015, it was again moving to one formula for that local contribution. It very explicitly said a student-based formula that allows for a base and weights. And then the things that were also, flexibility, a review of the system, and then making sure that we are really able to report transparently on what those outcomes are. So very, very similar to what we are hearing now. We're seeing some of those updates based on the last 6 years. So here's the feedback that we're hearing, which is super exciting. So the first is just as a reminder, most states who have made transitions, and again, it's a big deal to think about a new funding formula, but 39 states are now in a student base. They've moved from resource to student base. You see there are 10 states that are still resource. Obviously, we are one of them. And then Wisconsin has what's a guaranteed tax base. It's a pretty complicated tax-based structure. So we're seeing a lot of movement in that space. In the SEC region, which I know is kind of our comparison models, it's just us, North Carolina, and Alabama in the Southeast that are still in a resource-based model. In terms of the overall feedback that we are receiving, and this is just general to the formula itself, there are 4 kind of big pieces of feedback that have come through. So one is that districts, and no surprise, they want to make sure that whatever they've received, last year or the year before, they're not going to get less funding from the state. They want to make sure, and this is across the board, every stakeholder, flexibility so that people can invest in ways that meet local needs. Lake County and Memphis are going to need very different things. And so they want to be able to invest in ways that boost their student achievement. In terms of the things that are outside of the BEP now, So you're looking at things like BPK, coordinated school health. Fun fact, we spend about $1.7 million on driver's ed. So those types of things would come into a new formula. So we don't have to keep funding things, quote unquote, outside of the BEP. And then the last part is on that local contribution. County commissioners have really talked about reconsidering that to be more aligned with what they feel is fair for their contexts. And our superintendents and school districts, of course, want to make sure that maintenance of effort or the additional amount is still there. So this isn't actually supplanting, the state isn't supplanting what is already being invested. So those are some of the big picture feedback pieces we've got. In terms of actual components of the formula, you've got your base, your weights, additional dollars, and outcomes. For the base, not really anything surprising. We're hearing a lot about nurses and counselors, of course. Teacher salaries is a large one. More on school psychologists. That's gone in and out of the BEP review committee, but a lot on that. We don't fund a principal at every school. We've got just under 300 schools where the BEP funds half a principal, but not a full principal. So those districts are really saying it'd be great if you could fund a whole principal for our school. And then technology and facilities are also some things that have come up, especially when we look at the deferred maintenance costs in the state for our school districts, and then technology, replacing the devices that lots of folks just purchased with relief funds. This is the most, these are consistent things across the state, school districts, types, regions of Tennessee. So that's been remarkably consistent. For weights, the things that once you have your base, additional funding, and these are based on student characteristics, we've heard again a lot of consistency here. So economically disadvantaged and then concentration of poverty, 5% of your kids economically disadvantaged versus 95%. There is that multiplier effect. So we've heard a lot about that. Students with disabilities, folks are spending a lot of funding locally to account for the cost of educating children with disabilities. We're about 13% in the state. A lot on dyslexia. That has been something that we've heard more and more about over the last several years. Lots of legislation has been passed from a policy perspective, but really making sure students get services. English learners is one of our fastest growing populations. We're just about 60,000 students in the state, and they have various needs based on their English language proficiency. So making sure there's services to ensure they get proficient in the language as quickly as possible. And then I think some ones that we're hearing a lot about that are not in the BEP is rural and sparsity. We don't have any additional funding for our rural districts or our sparse districts, or and that's been, I think, a really big concern for many of our superintendents.
How do you differentiate between rural and sparse?
Yep. So rural, we would use the federal definition potentially, but we're getting feedback on that. The best example I have on sparsity is you take Campbell County, which sometimes it's rural, sometimes it's not on the federal definition because of how many miles away from Knoxville. But I think we would generally say is rural. Small. Sparsity would be like Hickman County, 3,000 students approximately, but one of the top 5 largest geographic areas. So the transportation needs for students is significantly higher than you might see in a small district. That's been some really good feedback that we've heard there. And then we've heard, I would say, hit and miss, but we've heard a lot on public charter schools. And then we spend a lot outside of BEP for the charter school facility fund. Again, this would be, we would need to bring that into a single formula. And then certainly there have been quite a few comments about what the needs might be for those types of schools. And so these are the biggest bullets that we've heard.
What have been the primary things you've heard from the students?
Yes, so that's, like I said, my favorite subcommittee, and they are, you have to have a chair and then the subcommittees vote on a vice chair. And they were the only subcommittee where every single person said, I want to be the vice chair. So we have one chair and we have 8 vice chairs. So,
well, and also let me say thank you for engaging directly with students.
They're fantastic.
Their perspective certainly matters, and it's certainly something that we need to consider.
Yeah, and it's been fascinating to see. They come to the town halls, they've watched all the videos, they've done their homework, and we've been meeting with other communities, like we were at Central High School in Rutherford even, to get additional student feedback. They are really focused on opportunity. They want to make sure no matter where they live, they have access to CTE courses, dual credit opportunities, that they get that leg up in high school, and it shouldn't matter what part of the state you live in. So they've been very strong on that. And the other thing that we've heard a lot about is teachers. They want to make sure, depending on what part of the state they live in, they've really talked about, I don't want to sub. I don't want to have a vacancy. I want a really good teacher to make sure I'm prepared. I want to make sure that my teacher wants to be there and is excited to be there. I learn so much when I have engaged teachers. I want to make sure that they stay. I think they hear the same things that lots of us hear about potential teacher turnover. They adore their teachers. And then we're hearing a lot, I think, in the early space, mostly they're high school students. And so they're kind of hearkening back to elementary, middle school, and talking a lot about making sure they were ready for high school. So some of that is about literacy. Some of that's about more middle school CTE opportunities. That's come through loud and clear.
What if a district has a robust CTE program? Does that change and maybe the needs for the equipment and supplies for a CTE program might be greater than one for a STEM focused school? How does that weigh into it?
Yeah, we've heard a lot about specifically CTE programs and I think specific groups. So like AGS come full force and said, this is what we want. And that's going to be different than welding or potentially for computer science. And so that's some of the things we've heard in this additional dollars bucket. We have a little bit of CTE dollars in our current formula, but we've heard a lot of feedback that said, look, we have 21 innovative high schools. We're doing all these STEM designated schools. We've got the GIVE program. How do we maintain these great programs? People are saying if there was a way for the state to contribute to making sure we can get updated machinery or equipment and not limit. And so that's been, I think, really helpful, helpful feedback. And that gets us to the additional dollars section. And these are things where it's not a student characteristic, but they are things that people said were important for funding. We've heard a lot about fast growing, especially with all of the new businesses and companies coming to Tennessee. Lots of areas are growing really quickly. That means new school buildings. That means some infrastructure changes, lots on broadband, things like that. So those districts were very interested in what does that mean for us in terms of being able to keep up with the new folks who are coming in. Middle school CTE and innovative high schools, lots on career development. I've been thrilled to hear districts, parents, and business communities come together and say we really need to make sure not just high school, but middle school focuses on career development and opportunities. So it's more of a 6-year program as opposed to just a 4-year in high school. And we've seen a lot of focus there. And then we have the learning loss and student acceleration bill that was passed last special session. The one component of that is the 4th grade tutoring. So those students who are at the below level after 3rd grade, and that's a year from this spring, would then have to do tutoring or be required to participate in high dosage tutoring. Districts were interested in what that might look like for them. And so those are some of the components. Dollars that we've heard. And then last is outcomes. Some states do outcomes, some states do not. 2 of the examples that we have seen are Florida and Texas. We've also seen a little bit in Maryland related to being able to provide compensation for teachers who do more, like get national board certified, et cetera. So we've heard a little bit about that. A lot of interest in seeing what it means to incentivize getting students enrolled in advanced programs and then having them complete. So for example, and I think Florida is a good example of that, they went from, they started to give additional dollars for those students who completed post-secondary programs, an industry certification, or something that made them ready for post-high school life. They had a very small number of students when they started that, and they've gone up to, I believe it's 100,000 students. It went from like 500 to 100,000 statewide, because ultimately we all want to do what's best for students. What motivates a lot is if I'm going to get additional resources for it to support that program, or I'm held accountable to it, I now know that this is a priority from the state. We don't have that in the BEP right now. And so saying things like early post-secondary AP course completion, industry certification, those are all things that if students complete something, if they pass an AP class, if they earn the certification, the district would then earn additional dollars for that student. It allows the district to fund those programs. Now you will have districts who cannot do this right now, right? They don't have access to a TCAT. They don't have the technology. There are some limitations. And that's why that year-long transition process would be so important, because it allows them to have some funding to make the transition so they can access those opportunities.
Is this really where accountability comes into play?
Yes.
And is this really the measurable location for accountability in this formula? This proposed plan?
I do. I think it is here in terms of what did the dollars produce? for an incentivize. I also think there's transparent reporting that needs to happen. So at the school level, how much money did this school generate from the students? Not at the district level, but the school level. How were those dollars spent? And then what are the outcomes over time in terms of any funding? We just can't do that with the BEP, but as a parent, as a community member, and as a district, it allows us to have that transparent reporting. And then we also incentivize additional funding to keep some of those good programs going. So it's both of those together.
There would be reporting requirements.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a really strong push, no surprise, on reading proficiency or some level of reading. That came very loud and clear from the steering committee. Lots of investment, certainly from you, sir, as well as from the General Assembly on early literacy. We have to find an appropriate way to measure that. And so that's something that we're looking into, but certainly want to make sure it's not just a high school metric, but there's incentives across the board. So the last thing I'll say on outcomes, and this is a decision point that we're going to get more feedback on, is this just open to those students who have traditionally been lower performing, so economically disadvantaged students with disabilities and English learners, or is this something that would be open to any student in the state and really saying no matter where you live, we want to provide additional outcomes to meet those benchmarks, or is it just to incentivize some of the gaps that we're seeing in terms of access and opportunity for kids? So that's going to be something that will be a robust conversation in terms of some additional feedback we're soliciting.
And I would guess there's best practices around the country for that we can look at and see what really drives ultimate best outcomes, what really creates a best strategy for the state.
Yes, that's right. That's right. But it's possibility of what we could actually think about with funding. And then next steps, we have 6 subcommittee meetings that will be done by the end of January. We continue to engage with the steering committee for regular feedback. We are going to close public comment on January 14th. That gives us 2 more subcommittee meetings to really spend time finalizing any kind of proposal that would come forward. And then the steering committee is going to really focus a lot more at the tail end of January. You'll have a proposed structure of a formula and then some policy considerations that go with that. An example would be, how do we define economically disadvantaged, right? We have to make sure, how do you define rural? We want to make sure that that's super tight and clear. I think that was a really big piece of feedback from superintendents also. They want to know what counts and what doesn't, and have that be consistent. That predictability is really important for local budgeting. And then our goal is to have something, and we'll have kind of public comment throughout that process, and then have an opportunity to really have something proposed, have something public, and certainly believe that it will be aligned with what we've been hearing since 2004 at least, and then certainly robustly over the last 3 months. And that is where we are.
Right. Yeah. What have you of the feedback and through the process of town halls and subcommittee meetings and public comment period, what are people most concerned about in this process? So what do you hear about that they are cautious or concerned about?
Yeah, we hear 3 to 4 similar trends. I think first is a concern, is this really about vouchers and ESAs? Just very candidly.
Based on what?
You know, I don't know if I could say that. I think, you know, that has, I think school choice in general has been a real kind of key part of the administration. And I think lots of really bold action has been taken. And I think there are folks who are saying, is this about public school education and funding, or is this some other thing? And so that's been something we've been talking at length about.
I think it's important, and I'll just say this as we're publicly here, I think it's important that we address that, because this public school funding is not connected to choice issues. It's not connected to ESAs. They're 2 entirely different things. And we need to make sure people understand that. So there's not, well, that question it gets answered immediately.
Yep.
What else have you heard about?
A little bit on timeline. I think we are doing this very robust public process between October and January. And I think we're at that point where we've been talking about it for a really long time. It's the same trends. I gave you an example of how many different reports and commissions, but now we're at that point where it's the action. Sam and I were joking a little bit. It's kind of like the day before your wedding, and you know that you've committed to something and you're going for it. I think there's just that that need to act and the should we take a little bit more time. That being said, that's pretty split. I would say 60 to 75% of folks are like, look, if this is what you're talking about, if you're saying we actually might do the things we've been talking about for years, sign me up. But until I see it, I'm just a little bit hesitant to believe that it's real because we've been talking about it for so long.
And we have a bit of a significant portion of the process still to happen.
That's right.
We've got till the end of January, and then we've got a lot of work to do.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
And then the only other thing is certainly around funding in general. I think there's been, does this mean more funding?
Yeah.
Is this redistributing the existing funding? That's been one of the bigger comments outside of local contributions. We've heard quite a bit on that.
Which we'll be addressing here as we move forward in the weeks ahead. Are you going to be able to provide a framework even in the coming weeks during the month of January that allows these subcommittees to look at, based on the feedback we've gotten so far, here's the framework, here's what we're looking at, and allow them to develop and more, have that plan completed and developed by the end of the month?
Yes, so what we are planning to do over the next 2 weeks is to take the feedback we've heard so far, and we've gotten quite a bit of comment even just in the week before break, and just last couple of days even. And so be able to say, this is what that framework and structure looks like. We would like to be able to put that out for public comment more directly. Feedback come in, and then the feedback plus that structure go to the subcommittees for their meeting number 5. So they actually have something very definitive to respond to. Here's what we've heard so far. Here's what we've built. What do you think about that? And then meeting number 6 would be, here's kind of where we are. Here are the policy considerations. Any final thoughts? So that we are kind of expecting that the week of January 10th, sometime during that week, getting that feedback by that end of public comment, January 14th. And then moving from there. That gives about 3 weeks for kind of really being able to bump it around and make sure that it's what we collectively have said.
Question? Tony, you got anything?
When you think about driving outcomes, do other states do that on an annual basis? Is it a rolling average over time? I kind of think about from a district perspective. Every year, students are a little bit of a moving target. What are some? Did you get any feedback as to timing and sequencing for that?
Yeah, a little bit. So I think from a rollout perspective and then an ongoing perspective, we really would want to make sure that there's at least a year. So let's say hypothetically we were implementing any kind of new proposal. We would want a year for people to make changes to their internal systems and have the flexibility to do that. After that, right now we have, we take the ADM every year, and that is for the next year. So we're always kind of a year behind. I think generally speaking, that allows districts to prepare and plan a little bit more versus a during year. Some states have a during year. And so whatever your attendance changes or outcomes changes during that year, it kind of evolves over time. That's a really hard budgeting practice. Right now, there's, what you're getting for that year. I think that 1 year delay on the outcome side also allows us to say, look, this is, let's say it's passing an AP course or earning an industry certification. A lot of times we get that in June or July, that information. So that would be available for that following school year, as opposed to kind of you're kind of check right then for that year that just ended.
Yeah, it seems like you've rapid enough to say, hey, something is amiss here. Also want to have enough time to develop a strategy.
That's right. That'll be important. And I think you're right that responsiveness. So if I have, X number of students who earned an industry certification and that we've seen some growth in that, I want to be able to get the outcomes funding and be able to see that, report to my board about it, make sure that I'm able to then invest in some of those same areas or expand programs where I've seen a lot of potential. And we're hearing districts really think about what that means for incentivizing businesses into their community, being more proactive and saying, look, we think we can be the ag tech center of the country. Let's talk about Northwest Tennessee. What would that mean in terms of some front loading to get the equipment, the resources, the pipelines, the CTE pathways in place knowing that we're going to have this stream of funding if we can have students achieve outcomes related to that, and then start to work with labor and workforce to have companies know that this is a place where they have labor available and students have good paying jobs after high school. And we've given them the opportunities for post-secondary credit much earlier than otherwise would have been true. It's a really interesting way to, and I think a neat opportunity to meld those together. Wes was for you.
And Ag Tech was for me.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right. No, you're on.
Thanks for this report. I think, first of all, I want to publicly thank the people who've been engaged in this process, the citizens and the stakeholders and the students and those that have been a part of the 18 subcommittees and regional town halls and local town halls. And we have a lot of work to do yet, but I'm very encouraged with what we're hearing. It is time to make a change. I think public school funding is about the children of this state and their education, and that's the most important. That's the most important thing that we can consider when we think about the future of our state and being a leader in the country, is how are we investing in the education of our children, and particularly our public schools. We are due for a strategy that is money well spent and not just more money. We have increased funding every year since I've been here, and we'll continue to do that, but we don't need to just keep putting money into a formula that is 30 years old and doesn't match the needs of our kids today. So I think it's time. I think this process is a good one. I believe we can be ready if the process continues to unfold appropriately. But the work so far is good. Thank you very much for
Thank you,
that.
sir.
And
Appreciate that.
don't let up. So,
I never do. Thank you. Sir.
thank you, everyone.
Guys, we're gonna set out on hold for our available, so if you want to get set up, you'll work with everybody out there and Governor and Commissioners will be available.
All right.